Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture, our final lecture of the semester. So I'll try to keep this relatively brief. Hopefully by now we are all in the midst of working on our final papers. So I got you guys started last week. We talked about some of those important preliminary steps. Choosing the text that you want to write about, doing some of that early pre-writing. We talked about that, idea generation, just getting stuff down on paper. And then hopefully we started working on outlines. I'll talk a little bit more about outlines today. Hopefully you guys were able to get started on your research last week. And one thing I forgot to mention in the week 7 lecture, but I did mention it in the week 7 module, is that you guys need to choose one of those critical approaches or critical theories that we talked about back in week 6 in order to help sort of guide you on the final paper. Don't look at that as extra work. Look at that as a way to generate more original analysis because, by using one of those critical approaches, you're going to have a particular sort of angle or perspective that you can take on your chosen text. You'll be able to look for certain things. You'll be able to make original claims using that critical approach. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today, but that's really going to be a helpful tool, another method for you to generate original content. So we'll cover that in more detail today because we can continue to think about how we're going to use our critical approach on our paper. So I don't want to go back over all the stuff that we did last week. Instead, I want to progress. And I hope we're all ready at this point to sort of finish up pre-writing and then move on to drafting. Because remember, another thing I talked about last week was the writing process and just the importance of following the basic steps of the writing process when we are tackling an assignment of this length, of this scope, and this importance. So we spent last week really on pre-writing. So we should be now on our final step of pre-writing, which is outlining. So I got a little confused last week. I think I was telling you guys that your outlines were due at the end of week 7, but that is not true. If you were looking at our schedule or if you went into the assignments tab in our module, you would have seen that the outlines are actually due in the middle of this week. Rough drafts of the paper are due at the end of the week, and then as I've already mentioned, final drafts are due on August 9th, which is the Tuesday of next week. So that is our timeline. I got a little mixed up. I thought for some reason that I had combined the outline and rough draft into one single assignment, but clearly I did not do that. They are separate assignments. So if you guys take a look at the week 8 module, you'll see that the outline is due first, then the rough draft, and then of course finally the final draft. So I've gone ahead and posted my sample outline. Again, I was a little early with the outlining, so I think I said last week that I would post it in the week 7 module. And I did at the end of last week, but it's also in the week 8 module. So if you're ready to start outlining now, that's great. I talked about outlines last week and how they're really just our plan for the paper. But we want to be pretty specific with that plan. So we really want to have a plan for each individual paragraph that we're planning to write in the paper. So you can look at my sample. I'm kind of walking you through some of the basic things that you need to do in each paragraph. Some of it is pretty self-explanatory, like we said last week. The intro paragraph, the concluding paragraph, we tend to know what we are doing in those paragraphs, what we are going to do when we write those paragraphs. But what's really important for the outline is to plan the bodies, because the body paragraphs will contain most of your original analysis, most of your original claims, most of your examples, all of the good stuff, most of the good stuff will be in the bodies, and you're going to have a lot of bodies. So you might not know the exact number yet, but it's good to start planning paragraphs. Go ahead and start planning 5 bodies, maybe 6 body paragraphs. And then if you need more, if you realize later that you're going to need more, that's fine. You can plan those as you come to them, or you might get into a writing groove and you might start cranking out some brand new paragraphs. That does happen, right? So, we like to have a detailed plan, but once we start drafting, and hopefully we're ready to start drafting soon, once we start putting together that rough draft, we can make some small departures from our outline. We might expand on certain things that we included in our outline. We might realize that while we just had one body paragraph planned on imagery and metaphors, we might actually want to spend 2 or 3 body paragraphs talking about those elements. Maybe we planned one body to discuss one particular character in the story, but it turns out we have more to say about that character, so we want to write additional paragraphs. That's fine. That often does happen when you're drafting, but again, the outline is the blueprint. It's something to go by. It's something that can give you some guidance and some structure, and that really will make the drafting part of the writing process go more smoothly. Because I'm sure we've all had the experience at some point of sitting down in front of a blank computer screen and trying to start a draft from scratch. That works in lower level English classes. Sometimes it might work for shorter assignments, simpler assignments. But for a paper like this, that's very, very difficult. We don't want to skip all of that pre-writing stuff. So hopefully you've already done the idea generation. You've already gone back through your text. Remember, that's a really important part of pre-writing. To go back to your chosen text, reread it, or at least read parts of it again. Take notes. We talked about that last week. Underline, annotate. You can then use those notes when you're outlining. When you're thinking about the stuff you want to talk about in your body paragraphs, look at your annotations. Look at the ideas you jotted down a few days prior. A lot of that stuff is probably good. You might want to pursue some of that stuff. You might not pursue all of it. That's fine. But even if you just stick with half of the notes that you took, even if you just grab 3 or 4 ideas that you wrote down during one of your brainstorming sessions, that's still productive. That's still a good start, and you can always build on that. So, yeah, the outlines are due at the midpoint of this week. So a little strange, I know. Things are a little odd here at the end with our deadlines because we're sort of deviating from our normal turn everything in on Sunday night at the end of the week routine. But obviously this is the last week, so we have to move a little bit quickly now. So I want to see outlines by Wednesday. All right, August the 3rd. That's the middle of the week. We're keeping the time the same, so it'll be due by midnight on Wednesday. I'll try to look at those outlines as quickly as I can. Often it might take me a week to get assignments back to you guys to grade your assignments, but with the outlines I can move pretty quickly because they're pretty informal. You don't have to, include an extraordinary amount of detail. I just want to see that you're thinking about your papers. I want to see that you have a plan, that you have some idea of what you want to do. And also, I can take a look at your overall argument. I would very much like you guys to plug in your thesis statement into your intro paragraph. That's a very important feature of the intro paragraph. So you don't have to write everything yet, but one thing that you should go ahead and write is that thesis statement. It can be sort of a rough draft of your thesis. You might want to think about it that way. You're not married to it. You can make modifications to it. But I just want to see what kinds of arguments you guys are planning to make. And then I can offer a little bit of feedback if I think you need to make a change or, focus on one thing, not the other thing. Whatever, I'll have plenty of time to get that information to you, and you can make some adjustments before you start writing your rough draft. So get me those outlines by Wednesday. I should be able to have feedback to you by the following day. Just give me maybe 24 hours. And by the end of the day, Thursday, you should have your outlines back. If everything looks good on your outline, I probably won't say very much other than proceed, keep going. This looks good, and I'll give you full credit. I'll give you, I'm looking to give everybody close to full credit as long as I can see some effort. You don't have to have everything figured out, but I just want to see a plan, some kind of plan. And if I see one, you'll at least get close to full credit. But if it looks really good, and if I can tell you've really gotten a good start and you're really engaged with your text, and maybe you're already starting to write some of the sentences that will later appear in your paragraphs, then, like I said, I won't have a lot to say. You'll get full credit, and I'll just tell you to get moving on your rough draft. So the rough drafts will be coming in at the end of the week. But if you want to get yours in a little bit earlier than that, a little bit sooner, that's great. Okay? Because we are going to be a little crunched for time at the end. But what I would like to do is have some time to read through the rough drafts and just give you guys one last brief round of feedback so you can make some necessary revisions and edits before submitting the final draft by next Tuesday. So if the rough drafts are all in by Sunday at midnight, that's fine. I can get you feedback by the following day, Monday, and then you at least have a 24-hour period to do the final stage of the writing process, which is post-writing. That means revising and editing. So I do want to talk about that final part of the writing process today, because that's the final stuff that you guys need to be doing. As this upcoming weekend ends, and as the beginning of next week dawns, you need to be working with a completed draft. You don't want to be writing right up until the deadline. That's never good practice. That's never best practice when it comes to writing success. You want to leave yourself some time for post-writing, because everybody will need to make at least some revisions and edits before they submit if you want your final draft to be as successful as it can be. So we'll talk about that. That's sort of our final step before everything is complete. So just let me know if you have any questions about our schedule, about any of these due dates. Again, I'm sorry that I misspoke last week. I might have confused you about when the outlines and rough drafts are due, but everything is correct and up to date in the Week 8 module. So just take a look, and like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. So I want to talk about drafting today. We've already discussed outlining. I've already kind of told you guys how to approach it, the importance of it, and you have my sample outline to guide you. So at this point, you should be ready to outline. If you've already chosen your text, read it again, worked with it a little bit more, like we said, we have notes, we've done some research, because you might want to start planning where you're going to be talking about your sources. That's another thing you can plan in your outline. Okay, I'm going to use my first source in this body paragraph. I'm going to quote my second source in my fourth body paragraph, whatever. That's another thing to start planning. And also, you're thinking now about the critical approach that you might use. You need to sort of introduce that critical approach in your intro, and then you need to use it in at least some of your body paragraphs. You don't have to use it constantly. You don't have to use it in every single body, but you do need to use that approach to help you generate some claims, some of your analysis, like we said. So you've done all that. So now you should be outlining at the beginning of this week. That's why I'm not giving us a ton of additional time. We just need a couple of days to produce an outline, and by Wednesday, you should have one ready to share. It can be informal. It can be a little bit rough, but I want more than just, one sentence descriptions of paragraphs. I want a little bit more detail than that. Again, look at my example and start plugging in some of the stuff that I'm talking about, some of the stuff that I'm including in my sample outline. Like I said, you don't have to write all of these paragraphs yet, but I want to know what you're going to be doing in each paragraph, not just a really general idea, but I want some kind of a topic sentence. I want you to maybe share an example or two from the text that you might use. Again, you can be talking about critical approaches, you can be using sources, you can just include a few points that you want to make, original thoughts that you want to share, whatever. And you can arrange it and format it however you want to. But just let me see your plan. You should be done with that by Wednesday. And once you've submitted that outline, you are finished with pre-writing. The last part of pre-writing is organizing. And that means outlining and making a schedule. So I would just mention briefly that you guys should think a little bit about your own individual schedules for this upcoming week. Now, I've already created a schedule for the class, and I've already, of course, assigned deadlines, but only you guys know when you have time to work on the paper. I don't know your individual schedules. I don't know when you work. I don't know your family lives. So I always encourage students, really at every level, to make up their own personal writing schedule. Based on what they know they're going to be doing in that upcoming week. So, block off some time. It doesn't really matter what day it is, but you need to block off some time for writing after Wednesday. If you're staying on my schedule, again, the outlines come in on Wednesday, and then either Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, and hopefully maybe 2 of those 4 days, you might need multiple writing blocks, multiple periods of time over those days where you can sit down and work. Maybe you have an hour on Thursday, 2 hours on Saturday, 1 hour on Sunday. That's fine, but you might need to write that down, or you might need to, look at your calendar, look at your agenda, and just make sure that you have time allotted to work on this paper. So when it comes to drafting, there's not a ton of rules. You need to give yourself some time, of course. Like some of us might be able to draft the entire paper in one sitting. You might get into a great rhythm. You might, get moving and you have a lot of ideas and you're using your outline and you have your text next to you and you're already really familiar with it. And that's great. But even if you're going to do it in a single sitting, don't forget that once you have that rough draft finished, you're not done. Right? You still have the post-writing stuff that we're going to talk about later, but obviously you want to have a finished draft as soon as possible because that's just a very necessary step in this larger process. So in order to finish, in order to not get stuck, you really need to write somewhat freely. I always tell people to approach drafting as a pretty open, sort of free exercise. You have your outline, you have all the preliminary work that you've done, maybe a source or two is in front of you. Certainly that text that you've chosen to write about should be in front of you. Your book should be open. You need to be looking directly at the text. But once you're ready to go, and remember, have the outline handy. We're using the outline to get us started on the draft, right? That's how we avoid sitting down and looking at that blank screen. But once you start drafting, just write. Don't worry too much about making mistakes. Don't worry about typos. Don't worry if everything sounds great or looks great. The important thing with drafting on that first go round, the important thing is to finish the draft. You want to get all the way to completion. You want to have all of the content that you planned in your outline. You want to go ahead and execute it. You want to produce it. You want to bring that outline to life, and that means all the paragraphs you had planned, write them. And if you determine that you need some additional paragraphs, write those too. If you want to wait until the end to tackle the intro paragraph, that's fine. Some writers do it that way. Some writers write all their body paragraphs first, and then they write their conclusion and their intro. If you want to do that, fine. If you want to write in sequential order, starting with your intro and then moving through all of your bodies and finishing with the conclusion, that's fine. There's no one right way. This is not math. There's different ways to write a paper, but you need to finish. If you haven't finished, you're going to get stuck and you're going to ultimately get really crunched for time at the end. So by the end of the week, we all need to have finished rough drafts. Again, they're rough. Not everything is perfect. Not everything looks or sounds exactly like you want it to. That's okay. Because once we finish that rough draft, we move on to post-writing. And that's when we clean up our work. That's when we revise and edit. That's what post-writing means. So by turning in rough drafts by Sunday, we'll have at least a little bit of time, 1 or 2 days, to revise and edit. And revising and editing is how we turn a rough draft into a final draft. Okay, if we don't complete our post-writing, then what we're turning in is ultimately going to be a rough draft. And rough drafts are great, but you don't want to give me your rough draft. You want to give me a polished final draft. Okay, so that's why I made the schedule the way I did. But if you want to give yourself more time for post-writing, feel free to submit the rough draft even before Sunday, even before the end of the week. If you're ready, if you have a bunch of time on Thursday to write and you have your outline ready to go, then maybe you have that draft finished by Friday or Saturday. And if that's the case, go ahead and submit it. I'll be checking a couple of days leading up to Sunday, and if I see some early submissions, I'll go ahead and look at those. I'll go ahead and provide feedback on those so we can sort of expedite this process a little bit. But feel free to take until Sunday. Maybe you don't have a lot of free time until the weekend. I know, again, everybody's schedule is different. So you can wait until the deadline or you can work a little bit early. But by the end of the week, you need to have a finished rough draft. And then you'll have time to revise and edit that draft using my feedback, but also using your own proofreading abilities. So drafting is free, right? Just go, just write. Get your ideas expressed in sentence and paragraph form. And just go. Don't worry about the mistakes. Get to the finish line. But then it's time to start proofreading. Once you have that rough draft in hand, you need to go back through it. And a lot of students don't like to do this. I understand. Sometimes we don't want to read our own work, either because we don't think it's interesting, we don't like it, it's been a painful process, we don't want to relive it, or we just don't feel like we have the time. But this is important. This is really a key part of writing. If you're not doing post-writing, then your writing is never going to be fully successful. And this goes for professionals as well. This is not simply a thing that students must do. Even professional writers have to revise. They have to edit. When I work on stuff, when I go back and look at my initial draft, I'm often shocked at how bad it is. The ideas aren't bad. My examples aren't bad, but a lot of my sentences are bad. A lot of my individual phrases and sentences sound weird and awkward and unclear. I see a ton of mistakes, right? Punctuation errors, run-on sentences, typos, typing in the wrong word, unclear statements, unclear pronoun usage. That's going to be the case in everybody's rough draft. We're all going to find mistakes like those. Don't feel bad. it's just a part of writing. Writing's hard, and we tend to compartmentalize. So when we're drafting and we're really focused on our ideas, we're focused on content, we're not paying as much attention to punctuation or the way things sound or how our sentences actually look. So a lot of mistakes are going to escape our notice. That's okay. That's normal. That's just kind of how the human brain works. So once we're, pretty comfortable with our ideas and we have enough material, we have enough paragraphs, we feel like, we're making our argument and we're feeling good about what we're saying, the final part is to work on how we're saying it. The final part is to revise and edit, which is really just about fine-tuning our language and also finding and eliminating mistakes. So we all make mistakes, that's fine, but you have to take the time to eliminate at least most of them. I'm not expecting perfection, but you obviously don't want a high number of grammatical or mechanical errors. We often call those sentence level errors. So I'm talking about missing commas, missing periods, but also stuff like comma splices, sentence fragments, run-on sentences, and little things that often occur. Missing apostrophes, not punctuating direct quotes properly. Citation errors. We're going to talk more about citations today. There are lots and lots of potential sentence level errors that we can commit, especially if we're not proofreading. Because again, a lot of these things happen during the drafting process. But then when we go back and we proofread, that means we're just going back through the draft and we're looking for anything that looks wrong, sounds weird, isn't clear, needs to be cleaned up. So sometimes there's a lot of overlap between revision and editing. They're actually slightly different. When you revise, that's a more all-purpose kind of general activity. Revising just means you're making improvements. You can do sentence level revision, but you can also do paragraph level revision. If you need to make changes to entire paragraphs, like maybe some of your body paragraphs just aren't long enough, they don't have enough stuff, you're not offering specific examples from the text, you're not making original points, maybe you're just summarizing, you're just repeating what you've already said. So you need to revise that paragraph. That could mean a lot of different things. Maybe you need to write a few new additional sentences. But in other cases, you might have the opposite problem. You might have paragraphs that are too long. They're doing too many different things. They're covering too many different ideas. They're overstuffed. Maybe you need to break them up into smaller, separate paragraphs. Or maybe you need to cut some of your sentences, eliminate some of that material if it's not all working. So sometimes revising means to add. Other times it means to cut, subtract. We don't like to cut stuff, especially if that brings us perilously close to not meeting the length requirement. But again, if you're finding parts of your paragraphs that aren't working, or an entire paragraph just isn't working, you're not really doing anything, it might be easier to just get rid of it and replace it with newer, better material. Okay? So in some cases, you're going to see individual sentences that you want to work on more. Oh, that sentence is just awkward. It's not clear what I'm saying. You probably know what you're saying, but you can tell it's not going to be clear to your readers. So you don't have to completely rewrite the sentence. You don't have to delete it. I don't recommend deleting all of your awkward or unclear sentences. Sometimes you might want to. Sometimes if the sentence is just a complete mess, or if you wrote it at 3 a.m, the previous day, and you were just delirious and not really making sense at all, that's fine. But most of the time, you can just make a few adjustments. Maybe take a word out. Take a couple of words out. Maybe you need to rearrange the order of some of the words. Maybe you just need to add something at the beginning of a sentence, a transition, or some kind of introductory phrase or clause that links that sentence to the sentence that came before. Or maybe you want to end the sentence in a different way to make it flow better with the sentence that's going to come next. Right? We have to build in transitions like that, but in between sentences and then sometimes in between paragraphs. Maybe you decide that you want to punctuate the sentence a little bit differently. Maybe you just want to make some other minor changes, but that's really what revision is all about. So any sentence that sounds weird, flag it, underline it, mark it somehow in your rough draft, and then revisit it. Decide how you want to make it better, and then do the same thing for your paragraphs. Yeah, this will take some time. That's why we need some time on Monday, or at the very latest Tuesday the 9th. We need time to do this before we submit those final drafts. So you revise first, but oftentimes when you're revising, you're going to find mistakes, right? You're going to find missing punctuation, or you're going to notice typos. I'm always amazed at how many typos I will commit. I'll add an extra letter at the end of a word, just a mistake, just a mishit, right? My finger just hits the wrong key. Or I mean to type the word quiet, but instead I typed quite. And that's the kind of thing that Microsoft Word or a similar kind of word processing program will not catch, because the word I typed in is a word. It is spelled correctly, but oftentimes word processors won't realize that you meant a different word. They might be able to catch it if it creates some other problem, but those kinds of mistakes often go undetected in a rough draft. Word might not catch it. You might not catch it until you go back through the draft a second or a third time. That's why this kind of stuff is so important. I mean, I'm using all of these examples because I see them all the time in student work. And again, I make the same kinds of mistakes. Professional writers make the same kinds of mistakes, but we always proofread our work, and usually, if you're submitting your stuff for publication, you'll have an editor look at it so they can also help eliminate your mistakes. You guys don't have the luxury of having an editor. I'm the closest thing you have to an editor, and I do provide some editing help. That reminds me, if you haven't yet, go back and look at my feedback on your previous assignments. I'm still finishing up our third short writing assignment, the analysis. I'm still finishing up my grading on those, but I've graded everything else. And I've given you guys feedback on all of our, writing assignments, our sort of substantial writing assignments, not the, discussion posts, but all of our real writing prompts. I've given you guys feedback both in a sort of broad general sense, and I've done some sentence level sort of line editing on your actual documents. So you guys need to take a look at that. Some of you might want to sort of use my comments to guide you both as you're drafting and as you're post writing, because some mistakes we tend to make frequently. Some things might show up in multiple papers. So if you're doing something that needs to be corrected or needs to be adjusted, I've probably told you that on at least one occasion, maybe multiple occasions. So use my feedback. That's why I write a fair amount of comments on your papers, so you guys can use that stuff to improve future assignments. So I have helped a little bit with editing, but you guys have to do a lot of this work for yourselves. So when you're revising, you will start to find mistakes, but really you need one final editing round at the very end. After you're finished messing with sentences and paragraphs, you're really comfortable with your content. So this means you're pretty much done revising. You feel like everything sounds pretty good. you like the order that your paragraphs are in. That's another thing you can do when you're working on paragraph level revision. You might realize you need to rearrange your paragraphs. Your second body paragraph perhaps needs to be your fourth. You might want to put them in a different order. You can do that. You can move stuff around. But you should be finished with all of that with a little bit of time to spare before the deadline. And the final thing is just do a final editing round. Go back through the draft a final time and just look for mistakes. Okay? The last thing to do is a final mistake check. Because when you're revising, yeah, you caught some, but I assure you there's probably more. There's always more than we think there will be. Because, again, with revision, we're sometimes still kind of thinking a little bit more about our ideas. We're thinking about how to express our ideas. We're thinking about the order that our paragraphs are going to go in. How does our thesis statement sound? Our mind isn't always locked on mistakes, typos, grammatical stuff, right? Because we're still kind of focused elsewhere. So for the final editing round, we're no longer thinking about content. We are just focused on searching for and eliminating mistakes. So give yourself at least a few minutes, like a half hour, 15 minutes. Do that final editing round before you turn in the final draft, okay? Because you will be able to catch a few last minute mistakes. Again, a few of them will probably escape you and they will end up in your final draft. That's all right. I don't expect perfection, but I don't want sloppy drafts. I don't want mistake-filled drafts. I don't want drafts that are unclear. Because for a paper like this, that kind of undermines what you're doing. So it's just important to have a certain level of professionalism and polish with a paper like this. Anything that we spend 2 weeks working on, it needs to be polished by the end. So if you guys want a little bit more help from me, if you want to get more feedback on your rough draft, I'm happy to do that, but you might need to step outside of Canvas. So if you want a lot of personal attention and a lot of feedback, in addition to submitting on Canvas, you can also email me your rough draft, particularly if you're kind of working a little bit ahead of schedule. You can email it to me. We can talk about it at length. I can give you feedback via email, but we can also meet in a video conference. You know, we can talk on the phone. We can just do an email exchange, whatever you guys want. I'm happy to look at multiple drafts because really, ideally, we would have multiple rough drafts, right? We would do one, and then we're going to make some significant additions or subtractions, some alterations, and then we're going to sort of have a second draft that's a good bit different than that first draft was, and then we continue to do that sort of work, and by the time we get to our third or our fourth draft, that can be our final draft. I realize we don't all have time to do that. That's what we would do in a perfect world, but if you are doing multiple drafts, or if you just want extra feedback on the rough draft that you're submitting, just talk to me, email me, and I'm happy to do that. Okay, so that's kind of how I want you guys to approach the drafting and post-writing. Obviously, you need more time for drafting than you need for post-writing, but don't neglect post-writing. Don't forget to revise and edit. Those things are really essential. And if you have any questions about revising or editing, or again, if you need some help, if you want me to kind of maybe sit down with you and walk through a draft, I'm always happy to do that. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about choosing a critical approach. I did not get into this last week, but I did mention it in the Week 7 module. So hopefully by now you guys are thinking about which one of those critical approaches or theories that we covered back in Week 6 might come in handy for you working on this final paper. I want you guys to choose wisely, okay? Just a little word of caution. You want to make sure that you're choosing a critical approach that you understand, an approach that you're kind of interested in, and an approach that works well with the text that you chose. You always choose your text first. Again, that should just be based on personal interest, what you like, what you enjoyed, and by now you should have gotten very familiar with that text. You know that text. You've read it multiple times. You've annotated it. You know it. So using your knowledge, start thinking about which critical approach would really pair well with the text. Does this text lend itself to a post-colonial reading based on where the novel takes place or maybe where the author is from? Do you think it lends itself to a feminist approach? Do you think it might work well with new historicism? If you're working with poetry, you really might want to think about formalism. That first critical approach that we talked about, the new critics. They were called that about 100 years ago, but they were the ones who pioneered the method of close reading. And they were all about staying inside the text and focusing exclusively on features and elements of the text. Remember, they don't care about authors. They don't care about historical context. But just choose wisely and put some thought into your choice, because you don't want to choose a critical approach because you think it might be easy or it's just the first one that comes to mind. And then, if you do that, mistakes happen. I saw this a lot in the spring. I had a lot of students who chose formalism as their critical approach. Maybe because it was the first one, I'm not really sure, but a lot of them told me in their intro paragraph, like they're supposed to, that they are using the formalist approach to help structure their analysis, and then they would almost immediately start talking about the author and historical context and the publication history of the text. In other words, all the things that the formalists specifically rejected. So that's not really a formalist approach, right, that those students were using. They were showing me that they hadn't paid attention to the critical approaches. They didn't really understand formalism, or they didn't remember it, so they were misusing it, and that's not helpful. Okay, so I'm not expecting you guys to be experts on these critical approaches. We only spent 1 week talking about literary criticism and theory, so I don't expect you guys to be pros. I don't expect you to be able to use the critical approach from start to finish. Like I said, you don't have to use it in every single body paragraph, but I do want to see that you guys are engaging with some of these critical schools at least a little bit. I want to see that you read the chapter in our book. I want to see that you watched that lecture back in week 6 and you have at least a basic understanding of your chosen approach. And as I've mentioned before, in some cases you can combine different approaches. Some texts might allow you to use new historicism and feminism. If you're maybe thinking about the roles of women in some previous historical era, or during the historical time period in which the author lived, or the time period being depicted in the story, those two approaches can kind of go well together. That's fine. Post-colonialism goes well with new historicism. They're kind of linked. They're kind of related in a lot of ways. You can use a psychological approach and something else, because we use psychology a lot, just like we use history a lot. So the historical approach and the psychological approach, they've been around. They've been used for a long time, and they can pair with other critical approaches when appropriate. So feminism and a psychoanalytic approach can often go well together. Almost any time that we are exploring character motivations, we're thinking about psychology. And in a similar way, like we've already said, we all use a little bit of formalism, or at least we should, because we should all be doing a little bit of close reading in our final papers, even if we're not explicitly using formalism, even if we're kind of more focused on new historicism or something else, even a Marxist approach, that's fine. But at some point, we want to analyze some language. We really want to dig into a particular scene or a particular passage of the text. So I encourage everybody to do at least a little bit of close reading. That's why we practiced close reading a few weeks ago. But if you're doing a formalist approach, you need to do a lot of close reading. You need to talk a whole lot about specific elements, and you should not discuss the author. You should not discuss history. And if you're going to discuss psychology, you really need to keep it completely focused on character. Because remember, formalists would say you don't leave the text. You don't talk about stuff that's outside the text. So what's ever in the text, yeah, that's fair game. But authors, readers, historical events, that's all kind of off limits. So think about that. A lot of people don't really dig that. So if you don't dig that, don't choose formalism, or explain yourself up front and tell us, hey, I'm going to do some formalism, but I'm also going to employ this other approach. You have to sort of justify what you're going to do, because again, we do have rules here. There are some rules and some specific schools of criticism, and we need to get the basic stuff here right when it comes to the schools and the critical approaches. You need to show me that you have that basic understanding. All right, so don't just choose something at random. Really put some thought into it. And again, think about what critical approach would work best for your text. Because I'll just go ahead and tell you now, not one of these, it's not like one of these is easier than the rest. They're all equally effective. They all require similar levels of rigor and effort and original thought. So there's not a shortcut. There's not one approach that's going to be easier than all of the others. You just need to pick what's best for you. And again, don't feel like you're married to it from start to finish, but I want to see that approach showing up in at least a few of your body paragraphs. And again, this is a tool. This is another tool of analysis, another way to generate ideas, another way to approach characters, symbols, anything else that you see in the text. Again, these critical schools will give you an angle or a perspective that you can take, and you might even use them to help generate your thesis. You might end up making an argument that's sort of based on a feminist reading or a new historicist reading, or a Marxist or a post-colonial or a psychoanalytic reading. You don't necessarily have to. I wouldn't say your argument has to be based on your critical approach, but it certainly can be, and that often works well. So just put some thought into that. And again, when you're outlining, go ahead and plug in some stuff from your critical approach. You know you need to introduce it in your intro. So if you're going to use two schools, you need to mention both and maybe sort of at least briefly explain why they go together or why you're using them together. It might be self-explanatory, but it might not be. And if it demands a little bit of explanation, you need to give that to us. So you can plan to do that, and then when you're planning your body paragraphs, base some of those plans around the critical approach that you're going to use. Okay. The final thing I wanted to really talk about today, because we have not talked about it at all so far, is citations. Okay? For a literary research paper, we have to include citations. The good news is most of you have already been doing at least some citation work in previous assignments, so that's good. We can sort of build on that. But remember, for a paper like this, we have two levels of citation. And we're talking about MLA citation rules. And remember, in English class, it's always MLA. So if you need to look up some things online, make sure you're searching for the right citation style. There are many different kinds. Chicago, APA, a bunch of stuff. We don't use anything but MLA in English. So if you're looking for examples, you always want to look for MLA citation examples. So for us, there's two levels. There's the in-text level. Those are often also called parenthetical citations. Those are the little short citations you include in the body of your paper anytime you're quoting from your text or from a source. Okay? Also, if you're summarizing or paraphrasing from one of your outside sources, one of the sources you found through research, you need an in-text citation when you quote from them, but you also need it if you're paraphrasing or summarizing, because those ideas from the outside source, those are not your ideas, right? You're getting those ideas from somewhere else, from the articles that you found on the databases. So just remember, I hope you guys learned that in 102. If you took my 102, you definitely learned that. When you're using sources, you have to provide a parenthetical citation, usually including the author's last name and a page number. You need to include that every time you quote from that source, every time you paraphrase that source, or every time you summarize that source. Remember, when you're summarizing and paraphrasing, that means you're putting their words into your own words. But the words are yours, great. So you're not using quote marks. The words belong to you, but the ideas aren't yours. You're just putting their ideas into your words. So you still have to give them credit for having the ideas. And that's what the parenthetical citation is for. Okay? And when you're quoting from your chosen text from the book, once again, you need parenthetical citations. Now, when you're providing brief plot summary about your chosen text, when you're just telling us stuff that happens, you don't need to provide in-text citations then. I know technically you are summarizing the text, but we can all sort of understand that we don't want to clutter up these papers with too many in-text citations. So the only time you need to provide in-text or parenthetical citations from your chosen literary text is when you're quoting it. Okay? But whether you're quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing your outside sources, and you need at least two of those, your outside sources that you found through research, you want to provide in-text citations in all three cases. Okay? So we're being a little bit more rigorous with the outside sources. Be sure you understand that distinction. Okay? With our chosen texts, we only need the in-text citations when we're quoting. For our outside sources, we need in-text citations if we're quoting, if we're paraphrasing, or if we're summarizing. And don't spend a lot of time summarizing your outside sources. I don't need to know everything that they are saying. I don't need a rundown of all of their key points. Remember, you're being sort of selfish and mercenary when it comes to research. You only use those sources to help you. You only use those sources to help advance your argument. Okay? And summarizing everything the author of that article in that academic journal that you found on JSTOR, summarizing everything that they say does not help you. Okay? You only need what's going to pair with your ideas, or what's going to provide support in your body paragraphs, or what's going to jive with your use of a critical approach. Don't give me fluff from your sources, okay? Don't just spend time talking in general about your sources. That's not helpful. You're only using them to help you make your argument. Remember, you're the star. The sources are just there to be another source of support, another tool, another piece of evidence, another thing you can use to help you drive home your argument. Okay? So make sure you're including correct in-text citations. And again, if you have an author and a page number, that's all you need to include. That's it. We like to keep our parenthetical or our in-text citations, it means the same thing. We like to keep them short and simple. The only variation is if you're quoting poetry, you typically include line numbers, not page numbers. Okay, because lyric poems, as we know, tend to be short. So you want to get a little bit more specific than just page number. You want to give us the line numbers. But you can still use the author's last name and just put line numbers instead of page numbers. But when it comes to your outside sources and any novel, any short story, or any play, you can provide the last name of the author and the page number. Okay? That will be fine for our purposes. Okay, so the other level of citation is the works cited page. So don't forget the works cited page. That will be the final page of your final paper document. Okay, the works cited page always gets its own page. It gets a separate page. Don't just shove it at the bottom of the final page of your paper. So if your paper is, 7 pages or whatever, the works cited page would be page 8. Okay. Every source that you use, all of your outside sources and the literary text that you used, all of those need to appear on your works cited page. Okay? So the works cited page will feature longer citations, as we know. You have to include more information. So I've posted some sample works cited pages, and if you take a look at the second page of my sample outline, you'll see some examples of in-text citations, and I'm also showing you guys a few ways to integrate quotes from your chosen text into your paper. This is kind of a tricky thing that takes a little bit of practice. It's great to have good examples. It's great to have really good direct quotes from your chosen text, but make sure you're smoothly integrating them into your own sentences. I talk about this in 102. We talk about quote sandwiches, which is a really easy way to think about integrating or bringing in your quotes. You usually need to introduce your quotes. So that means kind of the top slice of the sandwich, to use my 102 language. You introduce the quote, then you provide the quote, and then so the quote itself is the meat of the sandwich, and then the bottom slice of the sandwich is some kind of explanation or follow-up. So you got to do something with the quote. Once you've given it to us, you need to use it. You need to build an original claim on top of it. You need to use it to make your next point. You need to use it to make a comparison or to do something else that I listed in my tools of analysis, one of those other techniques or strategies. You need to do something with that quote. Talk about it. Tell us why it's significant. Tell us why it's really important at this particular moment in the story. Tell us how it connects to bigger ideas that are being expressed in the story. In some cases, the quote might not be 100% clear to us. You might have to do a little bit of explaining. You might have to explain what the speaker meant, and again, sort of, tell us the importance of the quote. So that's what I mean by a quote sandwich. And if you look at my examples, I'm kind of showing you ways to introduce or kind of get into the quotes. And then I'm also showing you how to provide correct in-text citations after the quotes. So remember, when you're quoting, when you're bringing in those specific examples from your text, make sure you're putting quote marks around the quotes, and then after you end the quote marks, that's when you have your in-text citation in the parentheses, okay, with the author's name and page number, and then after the parentheses, you have the period ending the sentence. And then your next sentence should really be that bottom slice of bread, the explanation or the follow-up that comes after the quote. So just look at my examples, play around a little bit with that. And again, if you can get some of your specific examples into your rough drafts, I'll be able to look at them, I'll see how they look, and I can give you some feedback on them. Okay, so that's it. I didn't keep the lecture that short, but hopefully I covered everything. If you have any questions, just email me. Again, we can set up a video conference. I'm happy to talk more. Send me drafts, send me outlines, send me questions. And good luck. Just remember, you are providing an original interpretation. Okay? Be argumentative. Take a stand. Take some chances and believe in yourselves. Remember that I'm here to help. And if I don't talk to you again, enjoy the rest of your summer. And I hope I see you guys again in future classes.